Let me just briefly welcome Dr. Jerry Malandra, Dr. Dejesus Gary, and Dr. Jungketer. And as usual, Kurush is our man of ceremonies and he will take this ahead. Let me thank Jerry for doing a wonderful job, and you will appreciate the efforts put in by our Alan Oscar and Shashank especially. Shashank Sawant is the artist who did the cover. Okay, with that, over to you, Kurush.
So thank you very, very much, Mugdha ma'am. And on behalf of the India Studies Center Trust and the Institution School of Archaeology, a very, very warm welcome to all of you all, and a very good evening to those of you all who are in India, and a good morning to those of you all who are in the United States. We are here today to celebrate the life of one of perhaps the most interesting men that I have ever had the good fortune to know. And I'm sure that those of you who know him will agree with me 100%. We're also basically here to release a phenomenally beautiful book, a really beautiful tribute written about him by one of his students and somebody that we look up to a lot, Dr. Jerry Malandra. And she's here all the way from the United States early in the morning. It's probably snowing in the Rocky Mountains around her. So a very, 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 very warm welcome to you, Dr. Malandra. We also have with us Professor Arvind Jamkedkar, an old friend and colleague of Professor Walter Spink. And he's there with us, as is his successor in many ways, Dr. Dejesus Gary, the director of the Directorate of Archaeology and Museums, Maharashtra, who's also here. So thank you very, very much to three of you all for being here today. And we look forward to hearing from you all about Walter. Brief introductions that I need to make. I had an amazing interaction with Walter way back in '93 for the first time, and realized that he was a man who looked at archaeology, art history, and architecture very, very differently from anybody else alive, not just Indian or foreign. He also believed in sharing very, very openly and very, very freely. He was also available to all his students. You could disagree with him to his face and face no repercussions whatsoever. And he was very, very interested in everybody's ideas. And he regularly changed his mind about things when he was shown otherwise. So in those respects, he was a wonderful man. And as an academic, of course, perhaps unparalleled by anybody else. Dr. Jerry Malandra, who's with us today, who has written this beautiful tribute to him, which we are releasing, is an Associate Director of Professional Development and Conference Services, Continuing Education and Extension at the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis. And in addition to her work on the prehistory, history, languages, and art of ancient South Asia, she has also pursued research of the prehistory and art of ancient Iran, on Sumerian and ancient Near Eastern and economic texts, and is probably one of the foremost authorities on the amazing, most beautiful, most wondrous rock-cut temple, perhaps anywhere in the world, the Kailasha. And she also drew my attention many years ago to the fact that if you do Kailashanatha and ancient aliens, you would get more than 40,000 hits on Google. I'm very proud to tell Dr. Malandra that it's now over 120,000. And that's not even been 10 years since she told us this. So definitely the ancient alien theory is gaining ground. We need to work harder at what we are doing. Professor Arun P Jamkedkar, of course, is the chairman of the Indian Council of Historical Research. He is the chancellor of the Deccan College deemed university. He is the ex-director of the Directorate of Archaeology and Museums. He is faculty and visiting professor at the KJ Somaya Institute and many, 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 many more institutes. A Sanskritist, a Paliist, if I can say that, an expert in Ardhamagadi and Prakrit. Also somebody who is absolutely a non-parai when it comes to art history, architecture, and archaeology, and who has been a mentor to us at the India Studies Center Trust, and before that for many years at the university. So a very, very warm welcome to you, sir. The third and not the least of them all is Dr. Dejesus Gary, my friend and colleague from many, many years ago, and continuing to be so from the Deccan College days. A brilliant archaeologist. Dr. Gary did his PhD on the Harappans and did an enormous amount of fieldwork in Haryana in very, very inhospitable conditions, creating a complete paradigm shift in how we understand the Harappans, right from the early Harappans to the late Harappans. His book, based on his thesis, is, of course, a phenomenal resource for all those doing Harappan studies. He worked with the Indian Archaeological Society under the late S.P. Gupta, who did shape him in many ways, and with whom he spent many happy years. He then moved on to the Archaeological Survey of India, and because of his sheer hard work, was posted for a long time in his early years to the head office itself and worked with some of the top people there and became an authority on the laws that govern archaeology, artifacts, and ancient Indian history in India today. And I don't think there's anybody better in this subject. In fact, we keep badgering him to lecture to our students year upon year on this topic. He also went on to do some phenomenal work at the Aurangabad Circle, where he worked on the Ajanta Caves and at the Ellora Caves and looked after their upkeep, and of course, his phenomenal work at the Daulatabad Fort. He went on to then not stop and sit on his laurels, but do some amazing work on the cannons of India. And he's already had 3 publications, and we look forward to many more. He then went on to the Northeast as an ASA, and finally was appointed director of the Directorate of Archaeology and Museums, Maharashtra, and he has been absolutely bootstrapping it back into shape. For 25 years, it had no archaeologist as the director, and he has been making an enormous change. So we have 3 very, very interesting people here with us today, and I think I've already taken up my 5 minutes of fame, and I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jerry Malandra to come and tell us about this book and about the man who she wrote about. Dr. Malandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kurush, and greetings to everyone who so kindly has zoomed into this launch. I'd like to express my gratitude to Mugdha Karnik, Kuresh Dalal, the institution staff for producing such a beautiful monograph and publishing it on Amazon so quickly. Also to Dr. Garge and Dr. Jamkedkar, amazing archaeologists. I've known Dr. Jungketer longer than Dr. Garge, but I consider them both models of how one can and should approach archaeology, art history, culture, and literature all at once. And I only wish I was several decades younger so I might be able to study and work with them a bit more. So thank you all for being here. This evening, Institution has produced for us an opportunity to highlight some of the key points in the monograph about Dr. Walter Spink, which I wrote in memory of him over a year ago. And now we're just past celebrating his 2nd death anniversary. And so this is a lovely and somewhat bittersweet moment to be able to reflect on some of the highlights of his personality, his career, and his impact. His interests, scholarship, and impact on Ajanta studies over a 6-decade career are too wide to have covered in a single paper. And tonight, all I can do is hit some of the highlights and reflect on some of the ideas that came up during the Institution presentation a year ago. I chose to dig down through decades, literally decades of his publications, to trace the development of his unique methodology and ideas that have made such a strong impact on views and scholarship about Ajanta, as Kurush Dalal has already hinted. His unending curiosity fueled a philosophy that there is always more to see, know, understand, and correct, and connect. I hope this overview will inspire readers to begin or to continue and enrich their own Ajanta studies. Ajanta, as I think you all know, represents the pinnacle of rock-cut temple architecture, sculpture, painting, preserving a unique repository of Maharashtra's ancient history, religion, and art. Dr. Spink's ultimate goal was to explicate the development and meaning of Ajanta in multiple dimensions. He spent over 60 years working at, thinking, talking, teaching, writing, and arguing about India's great ancient rock-cut monuments, most particularly Ajanta. Over the decades from the late 1950s to the 2010s, Dr. Spink systematically published important articles about India's rock-cut cave temples focusing on Ajanta. Toward the end of his career, he gathered and updated his work in a 7-volume magnum opus, Ajanta History and Development, published by Brill from 2005 to 2017. This is a unique detailed compilation and discussion of his findings, sources, interpretations, and arguments about how, when, and why the site of Ajanta was developed. My goal in the institution presentation and today's publication was to understand better how his ideas developed, what were the connecting threads and breakthrough moments, and how his earlier work led to his grand finale, AHD. This evening, I can just highlight some of the elements of his personal and academic background before and beyond Ajanta that influenced the development of his methods, key ideas, and publications. I'll touch on the differences and debates he had with other important Ajanta scholars, and then I'll briefly look at AHD, that's Ajanta History and Development, AHD's sources, contents, and its unique organization. And then I'll conclude with brief observations on the wide impact of and often strong reactions, positive and critical, to Dr. Spink's work. First, a brief site overview about Ajanta's uniqueness. It is one of many rock-cut Buddhist monuments in Maharashtra, including Bhaja, Karle, Junar, Kanheri, Aurangabad, and Ellora, all worth visiting and studying. Ajanta, however, stands out among them as the epitome of this heritage. Its stunning rock-cut architecture, sculpture, painting, and inscriptions have survived in remarkable condition, as I expect you all know, compared with other sites. The quantity and variety of Ajanta's features reflect a peak of artistic talent and creativity, fueled by tremendous focus and investments of the royal patrons and the monastic community. All of this, combined with 97 inscriptions, including several highly significant donative records, helps solidify Ajanta's historical context and meaning. According to the Spink chronology, it seems that when the Mahayana phase ended after around 480 CE, the site was essentially abandoned. This helped preserve its features for posterity to a much greater extent than other rock-cut monuments. Only in 1819, when an officer of the Madras army stumbled on the view of the site from across the Waghora range, was Ajanta rediscovered. Because of Ajanta's unique richness of evidence, Dr. Spink sought over decades of his career to collect and present all of the evidence that would help document, understand, reconstruct, and explain how Ajanta became Ajanta. This was not, however, just hard-nosed documentation. It also conveys the effect of being at Ajanta, moving through the caves, marveling at its stupendous creation. He was certain, and I'm quoting, that every one of the myriad features of the Ajanta Caves would ultimately be able to be securely located upon a developmental continuum between 462 and 480 CE, allowing no more than a year or two margin of error. A fundamental key to his methodology was the very precision of this work, preserving the faults of the planners and the workers, as well as their triumphs. For example, when a cell appears to be misaligned, we must seek the reason or reasons for such a seeming error. And this often points us in the direction of discovery. And here I'm quoting from him again. If such plans are cleaned up and straightened out, as is so often the case in publications, even in purportedly scholarly publications, they can no longer tell the truth. Now I'd like to talk a little about some of the constraints and controversies that his work engendered. Despite the wealth of data about Ajanta, scholars face a fundamental issue, not exclusive to Ajanta itself. Few hard facts about dating and patronage have been uncovered to establish an absolute chronology for its development. It gives all of us art historians and archaeologists plenty to study and argue about. Ajanta's 97 inscriptions are mostly quite short donative records. Caves 16, 17, and 26 contain much lengthier, important inscriptions, although not containing dates themselves. Their content and epigraphical style make it possible to link the site to sources more securely dated in external historical sources and figures. And I should, as a side note, mention that one of the great gifts of Ajanta history and development is the new, complete, critical edition written by epigraphist Richard S. Cohen, himself a critic and student of Spink's. Of all 97 inscriptions, this is a tremendous resource. As Dr. Spink discussed in his writing and speaking, he found just 3 absolute dates, none of which come from Ajanta itself, to anchor a relative chronology in the second half of the 5th century CE. Over the past 150 years, epigraphers, historians, and art historians have labored to record, translate, and interpret those inscriptions with reference to other known historical and literary records. These produce sequences for Ajanta ranging from centuries to a few decades, which had a lasting impact on Ajanta studies. Dr. Jamkedkar, who is with us tonight, reviewed the history of scholarship on Ajanta's dates and questioned the shortened chronology that Dr. Spink began arguing for after 1972. Dr. Jamkedkar wrote that the shortened chronology could only be accepted if the historical difficulties in interpreting the relevant epigraphic evidence were satisfactorily solved by him. Therefore, till then, Dr. Jamkedkar thought that Dr. Spink's earlier time bracket, around 465 to 500 CE for Ajanta, would be more acceptable. It is important to note, however, that he also wrote, Dr. Jamkedkar also wrote, that Professor Spink's art historical observations regarding the relative chronology of the caves and pertaining to architecture, sculpture, and painting at Ajanta, his observations regarding the relationship of the caves at Ajanta and other cave centers of contemporary times as Aurangabad, Bagh, etc., must be viewed seriously and taken into consideration. This leads me to a few comments on Dr. Spink's methodological approach and some breakthrough moments in his career. His unique combination of interests and talents deeply informed his worldview. Many scholars have written about Spink, and now a great resource is still available to all on walterspink.com. He encouraged questioning and relished dialogue, stating that, and I'm quoting, "the debates and disagreements about his Ajanta work is what kept him going." And he had a predilection for detail, perhaps stemming from his earlier interest in science. His dogged focus is well known. Compared with all that preceded him, Dr. Spink was to be an iconoclast, as a review of his work decade by decade illustrates, and that's what you'll find in this monograph. He carefully read and evaluated all of the scholarship and original sources available, but he did not stop there, using his field observations to read into the historical records more than many others may have been comfortable with. And he was to question his own authority, combining many types of information to adjust his reconstructions continually over nearly 60 years, as he embellished his core principle that much of Ajanta's development occurred quickly and simultaneously. I think it's fair to say that Spink was obsessed with chronology. It was not his only obsession, and it was not simply for the sake of dates. Rather, he urgently wanted to understand, reconstruct, and communicate Ajanta's complex sequence of development within its historical milieu. The sequence he reconstructed in his chronology of chronologies was to shorten in his work from 1966 to 2017, and that's a core part of the monograph as well. His first breakthrough moments occurred early in his career in the 1960s, when he realized that Ajanta's chronology was reconstructed incorrectly. As he recounted in AHD Volume 1, and I'm quoting, "It was my visit to the Ghatotkacha Vihara in the early 1960s that first got me involved in the long course of Ajanta's short history." And then, as he recounted a bit later in the Ajanta lecture in 2008, I'm quoting again, "It was not until about 1960 that I stumbled across the lucky evidence that proved how wrong I was in ascribing Ajanta's highly developed later style, typified by the scenes in Cave 1, to the 7th century. This was the crucial link to Ajanta with its Varahadeva inscription in Cave 16. He could see that motifs at Ajanta looked like those at Ghatotkacha. If the latter site was developed in the 5th century, he realized that Ajanta's must be 5th century as well. It was his 1966 Ghatotkacha article in which he first laid out a basic sequence and time chart for Ajanta that would permeate, with embellishments and corrections, his later writing. Here also, he stated his basic methodological approach, which was the anchor of his work for the next 50 years. Quoting, "The validity of this hypothesis must depend entirely upon the application of a particular art historical methodology involving a precise analysis of the development of forms, and rests on an implicit assumption of a sufficient body of material with which to work, to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that developments had to proceed in such and such a way. Ajanta presents a luxury of sculpted, painted, and architectural data that not all sites possess. A second breakthrough occurred at nearly the same time during what he called almost a tourist trip to Elephanta, Badami, and more, still in the 1960s. These early visits to rock-cut cave sites gave him a sense of relationships that contradicted the up till then common reconstructions of chronologies. Looking and looking, he suddenly realized if Badami were securely dated as a 6th century site by the inscription there, how could Elephanta be an 8th century site, as scholars then thought? And as a third breakthrough concept, although not a single moment, we must consider how his work demonstrated that many features of Ajanta's 29 excavations were simultaneous, not sequential. By the late 1960s, he thought the site might have lasted for much less than 50 or 60 years, ending with the end of the Vakatika's rule. His constant challenges were how to refine, prove, and convince critics of his conclusions. Also, at this early point, he saw continuous development in each cave. This was to change as more breakthroughs were to come. Nearly a decade later, in 1974, in his Splendors of Indra's Crown lecture, he introduced significant refinements he was making to his chronological reconstructions, stating that Ajanta's Mahayana caves were made circa 462 to 485. Also in the 1970s, he delved more deeply into inherent methodological issues. In his 1975 study of Cave 16, The Crucial Cave, for example, he wrote that, and I'm quoting, "The methodological argument here is that the development of the thousands of separate motifs at the site are so complex and the temporal relationships between the caves and parts of the caves so intricate that it seems to us less misleading to use precise dates than to round off the dates at 5 or 10-year intervals." The latter approach was to him inappropriate because, and another quote, "such a vast amount of work was accomplished in a mere quarter century." While the sequence in this article was generally like the chart published a year earlier in 1974, here for the first time, and as the accompanying chart in the article shows, he now saw Cave 1 as intact. It was never finished, and unlike many of the other caves, had no intrusive work. And he also, almost no intrusive work. And he also provided for the first time a narrative checklist with considerable art historical granular detail meshed with historical context to describe and illustrate chronologically crucial features of Cave 16. This was intended to support his argument about its dates and phases, a kind of narrative layering of evidence, citing layout, main Buddha features, doors and fittings, paint, and more. This foreshadows the actual checklists that he would publish in the future and in the content of AHD volumes 4 and 7. As he was to put it in his 1981 paper on Cave 1, quoting, "Because so many thousands of separate motifs were carved and painted at the site during the space of 20 years, we should be able to reconstruct, even if imperfectly, the gradual development of the site as a whole by reconstructing and considering the stylistic, iconographic, functional, and structural relationships between all of its separate parts." So he's refined what he was saying a decade earlier. But this means that we have to think in terms of fairly discrete year-by-year changes subject to a few years margin of error, since we can only date Ajanta's Mahayana phase by reference to a terminus ante quem 458, which must have preceded Ajanta's inauguration by at least a few years, and a terminus post quem 486, which must have come at least a few years after Ajanta's collapse. Now, shifting to a little bit on critiques. A crucial ongoing topic has been the validity of using literary evidence to fill in gaps in history, as discussed in Marashi's historical data in Dundon's Dashakumara Charita many years earlier. Dr. Spink certainly used this material to bolster the scant epigraphic evidence about the Vakataka dynasty, deriving history from art history. He took critiques seriously and presented them transparently. In AHD Volume 2, the title is Arguments About Ajanta, and there he reprinted, among other things, Dr. Karl Kandalwala's critique, together with papers by Dr. Jungketer, Brahmanand Deshpande, originally published in the 1990 Maharashtra Patik, with a rejoinder by Spink. He expected and relished debates. writing in 1981, needless to say, the reader should not accept my conclusions without subjecting my observations to a similar investigative process of his own. In lieu of doing this, I would only ask the reader to allow my judgments as hypotheses and to judge for himself if what I propose is reasonable. Dr. Spink continued to refine his view of Ajanta's chronology to the very end of his career. In AHD Volume 4, looking at painting, sculpture, and architecture year by year, he wrote, quoting, "These beginning and ending dates, 462 to 478, are flexible. A total of 14 years might be more reasonable than 17. Something like 464 to 477 might be closer to the truth." Now, stepping backwards to look at Ajanta history and development as a whole. Taken together, the 7 AHD volumes provide a unique resource on Ajanta studies. Objective data are combined and seen through the interpretive framework Dr. Spink developed over his decades of fieldwork, teaching, and writing. His focus on physical details in the caves fueled an elaborate series of multivariate synchronisms that he used to prove his nearly day-to-day chronological and historical reconstructions. Evidence from unfinished, intrusive features and unfinished caves were for him critical to the reconstructions. A great partisan of the Dashakumari Charita, he asserted that practically point-by-point synchronisms were correct between that text and the historical data he gathered from inscriptions and other sources, as long as he could assume that Harisena died on a certain date. And I think that has been a bone of contention with many, many critics. This mode of interpretation relied on some basic assumptions: an extremely active patronage at Ajanta, whose driving force was at least as much political as religious, and exquisitely sensitive to political change. Work that was highly responsive to that patronage, and simultaneous development of many aspects of Ajanta, as I said earlier. Now to conclude. Dr. Spink's advice was always to, and I'm quoting, look, 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 work, 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 and think, think, think. He said it in Stusen in 2015, it is staggering what we don't know. There is more thinking and working to do. When I interviewed him back in 1989, he told me, you can't know too much. That was daunting as a beginning scholar. I believe this was one of the keys to the Spink School of Ajanta Studies, and to his talent as a teacher. Ultimately, Dr. Spink gave precedence to the site as the best text about itself, and argued that art history could and should inform history drawn from texts alone. At the same time, he deeply engaged with inscriptions, the historical texts, and the work of others to develop, promote, and test his ideas. On-site documentation was critical, and he pioneered, at least in the United States, the creation of detailed photo sets, curated in archives open to all scholars, and not just about Ajanta. Ultimately, Dr. Spink's penchant to question what we observe and believe may be the source of his greatest impact on scholarship. As the art historian Susan Huntington wrote, I'm quoting her, "The questions he asked and the methods he has pursued have ensured that subsequent generations could never study the caves again without feeling the enormous impact of his scholarship." In all of this, Walter G. was a generous mentor and friend to so many, courageous and persistent. Students and colleagues have described his noble compassion for humankind, his vital combination of humanism and sound research methodology, his generosity, and his embodiment of the joie de vivre, the joy of living, that keeps us all forever young. Walter Spink was a relentless explorer and seeker, a scholar, a teacher, colleague, and friend to so many. He was inspiring and challenging, generous, compassionate, focused, and sometimes infuriating. His joy in research, discussion, and debate never ceased. He has left us with resources beyond compare. Certainly, his work on Ajanta must be cherished, but must not be allowed to stagnate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. And
thank you so very much for that.
Sorry, it's a little emotional.
And oops.
yeah.
Are we sharing the whole screen?
Yes, you are, but you can, click on the...
I'll mute myself now.
Now, right. This is right.
So now it's all right, ma'am?
Yes, yes.
So ladies and gentlemen, this is Walter M. Spink's Ajanta, his work and his legacy by Jerry Malandra. And Institution Trust is very, very proud to have put this up. It's available on our Amazon page. If you just Google Walter Spink on Amazon, I'm sure you will get it. It's in the Kindle store. It's available for just $1.99. And I think everybody should take a chance and download this. And this is a beautiful, beautiful testament to the man, his work, and his legacy. So on behalf of the India Study Center Trust and all of us gathered here, thank you so, so very much, Dr. Malandra, for such a beautiful piece of writing on somebody whom we all loved so very much. So to continue, our next speaker today, ladies and gentlemen.
Just a minute. We will be sending the link to everyone here by email.
So our next speaker, we again, as I've already introduced, is the one and only Dr. Arun P Jamkedkar. And we are also incredibly, incredibly happy to have him here with us. And he's been incredibly busy with other government meetings, but he's taken the time to be here. So Dr. Jamkedkar, the floor is absolutely yours.
You have to
unmute. You're muted.
Please unmute.
Yes.
Dr. Jerry Malandra and many other scholars who have worked on different aspects of the caves at Ajanta, and so many enthusiasts who want to know about Professor Spink's work and what significance it has got in the context of the studies connected with Ajanta in particular, and those connected with the cave architecture of Maharashtra. My own acquaintance with Professor Spink was very early when I was still doing my work on the Prakrit text. Then I was working as a lecturer in the Department of Ancient Indian History, Culture and Archaeology of the Nagpur University. And after that, as the Director of Archaeology and Museums of the state of Maharashtra. When I first of all was introduced to him by my friend Suresh Zadav, he gave an impression that he is a person who is passionate about Ajanta and does not speak anything else except Ajanta. Suresh was his assistant. And when I finished my thesis on Vasudev Hindi, I used to sit with Suresh because he was appearing for his graduate examination, and as he did not know Sanskrit or Prakrit, and I had the advantage of doing the Grundstufe of German, I was helping him to know German. And then, of course, sometimes we used to meet. It was only, you can say, after I was in Nagpur University that I started taking interest in things connected with Vakatakas. I first visited, of course, the earliest temple which was described by Professor Mirashi in his corpus inscription of Indicarum, that is the temple of Trivikrama. and then very suspiciously looked at the Varaha image which was in the Mandapa, because these were supposed to be the Vakataka vestiges. And of course, the set of images which were there at Pauna, on which it was again Professor Mirashi who wrote as the vestiges of the Vakataka period. That is how my interest grew, and slowly I could understand, to some extent at least, what Professor Spink was doing. In the meantime, I had a chance to go to Netherlands and, you can say, get a bit of training in art history under Professor Van Lohuizen de Leeuw. And I was having my own ideas. Even before I left for Holland in 1971, I had become acquainted with the material which was studied by Professor Mirashi. I had a chance, of course, as back as something like 1960 to see Ajanta. But I could never look at or understand or in a way judge or make any opinion of myself on the work of Professor Spink. In 1971 or before that, I had already formed the idea that the temples which were taken to be of the Bhosla period or Maratha period, those 5 or 6 temples must be of the Vakataka period. I shared these views with my friend, Professor Bandar Naike, who was studying in Oxford and at the same time in Amsterdam. And then slowly, when I became director and I was taking positive interest, visiting Ajanta many times with Suresh and Professor Spink, that I started understanding what Professor Spink was saying. And slowly, so many things came to my mind. If I look at him from my own point of view, I can say that he was the first person. You see, it was Mirashi who had written long back in 60s or 56, you can say, in 50s, end of 50s, the end of the 50s, that well, the 2 inscriptions which were one in Varaha Cave and one at Jinjala, they were by the same person, and therefore the whole chronology which was set up, or the chronological understanding which is shaped by Burgess and Ferguson, had to be set aside, because Burgess and Ferguson thought that Ajanta could not be before 550 AD, because they thought that the Satavahana rule came to an end in 400 CE, and they thought that there was something like a hiatus between the early Satavahana caves and the Vakataka caves. So they were dated to something like 550. But then the chronology of the Ajanta was looked at from all different points of view. It was, say, for example, some of the scholars like Banerjee, they dated Ajanta to something like 8th century because of the antiquity of the script there, that is the box-headed script, which was supposed to be of 8th century. Similarly, the Chandragupta's date was not supposed to be connected, and therefore the princess's date was decided on the basis of Devagupta, who was of 7th or 8th century. And that is why all those things which came, that is the cave number 1 having Chalukya's embassy and all those things. But then once this was in a way set up by Professor Mirashi, and he very clearly said that, well, it should be 462 or the middle of the 5th century, and many of the things, they started going away. And the things became more clear for me to understand what Professor Spink was saying. There was another thing which was connected. There are other scholars also who, on the basis of the pillar or other type of architectural members, such as the antarala between the Garbhagriha and the Mandapa in the caves, they were giving different dates. But one thing was very clear, right from the time of Burgess to all those other scholars, that this must have taken something like 150 years. They said that this will, but the general relative chronology was very clear. That was not, you can say, much change. Of course, Spink had his own arguments and he refined it very much. But the others agreed that the relative chronology at Ajanta of the later phase was quite fine. But then this clue was taken by Professor Spink of the caves, the Varahadev cave at Jinjala and 16 number cave at Ajanta. That made it very clear that this can be a work of one generation. How scholars many times very funnily argue that when this was accepted, still Khandalwala was not ready to accept that, well, it could be done in something like 20 years. He said that, you see, the cave number 16 must have been done by him, by Varahadeva, when he was something like 20 years. And the Jinjala cave was done when he was something like 80. So at least 60 years should have been there. But then when you follow, and the rest of the things have been made very clear by Dr. Jerry Malandra, that in a way you had to accept that it was done during one generation. And he was very clear that 462, you can say at the most 20 years, so you can say something like 483. There was another clue to decide about 483. And that was the association of the different kings who were connected with Harishena. Sa Kuntala, Avanti, Kalinga, Kosala, Trikuta, Lata, and Andhra. Harishena was having his, we won't say it was empire in the sense of, probably empire meant something different, but he had definitely a great influence, and he was the center of the mandala, if we accept it. I mean, if we define empire like that. All these dynasties, they were connected, and they were in some way or other connected with the Vidarbha, Western Vidarbha, and Harishena as the supreme ruler there. I had a chance to take Professor Spink to the cave at Patur. And then he also said that this must have been of the time of his father, that is Devasena, and that cave can be dated to something like 462. Now he was slowly coming to one thing, and that is one thing which he was all the time saying, that, well, after 150 years, it was the first experiment done at Ajanta or something like that. And the hiatus part was there. So that part was done away with, and we accepted there was some continuation. And definitely the period must be, I had written, when I was asked to write on Professor Spink's, in Pathik, I had given certain things. I must agree and very clearly accept that, well, I had not gone that deep into the understanding of Ajanta, and therefore I raised certain questions from the logical point of view. But the way he developed his different things, say, for example, there was another thing that was raised again by Khandalwala and others, Professor Mirashi himself included, that, well, Bagh had nothing to do with Ajanta because it was anterior to Ajanta. But then when we visit Bagh and take into consideration the different types of arguments based on the similarity of so many motifs and such type of things such as the fittings of the doorways into which Dr. Spink had gone, the things were narrowing down. And therefore, his chronology, which was now Bagh had some role to play in it, and it had to explain why a small period at Ajanta itself where the caves were abandoned. And in this, again, his own interpretation of the Dashakumara Charita was very important. There was another thing about which I would like to say, and that is, again, that refined my own understanding when the explorations of the different regions of Vidarbha, Eastern Vidarbha were carried on. The excavations at Mandal and other places done through the Department of Archaeology and Museums of Maharashtra, such as the Vivekanandapur site, then Washim itself, that made clear so many things. And we had a bigger picture in which we could understand the chronology of Ajanta. It was now accepted after these excavations were done in Eastern Vidarbha that there was a art historical tradition, you can say, of the Vakatakas who were of Eastern Vidarbha, and there is a connection between, you can say, the mainstream Gupta, and that we can understand Ajanta now better through the Eastern Vidarbha region. So those temples which are done, of course, there are hardly any caves about which we can talk more. I think there are caves, but they cannot be related to the caves at Ajanta or Western Maharashtra. With that picture becoming more and more clear that there were things which were done before, such as the 5 temples at Ramtek, and things which are done after, that is, you can say, the temple complex which is there at Mansar, that the picture of the Vidarbha, you can say, picture of the Vakataka art became more and more clear according to me, at least to me. There was another thing which you have to take into consideration, and that is of the inscriptions and the sites which were not directly under the Vakatakas, but were under their feudatories, such as the temples at Natna-Kutara, on which, of course, Professor Spink was very clear. He had written articles on some of the things, some of the items there. For example, some door frames and other things which were near Natna-Kutara, he had already worked upon. And he had suggested to us, and I took the advantage of that, and therefore my understanding about the Eastern Vakatakas as also the periphery regions wherein their vassals were ruling, such as the Vyagradeva who was at Natna-Kutara, or the Sankshova Maharaja who were at the nearby place. And the picture became, for me at least, more and more clear with the excavations at Nagra, for example, that there were parallels in plan between Nagra and those at the sites which were connected with the Sankshova Maharaja. There is one more thing which I would like to say, and that is probably connected with the content of the art at Ajanta. There were many, you can say, exchanges between scholars like Meena Talim and Professor Spink which were going on. And for Meena Talim, it was difficult to understand how the caves at Ajanta were called as Mahayana caves. She said that these are Hinayana caves. I think I learned a lot because of their exchange, that, well, we cannot call the caves at Ajanta as the Mahayana caves. They were the beginning of Mahayana. They are actually Sarvastivadin caves. And therefore, they can be a bridge between the Shravakayana caves, that is, which are referred to as the Hinayana caves, early caves, and the later Mahayana caves as at Ellora or Nasik and Aurangabad. So if we, again, because of the chronology, which was given a wonderful, you can say, a very clear, you can say, idea by Professor Spink, it is very easier to understand the connections between the site and his understanding, which was given right in something like 1972. That is, what were the relationships between the caves at Elephanta, Jogeshwari, and also at Ware Road, their relationship with the Vakataka, you can say, art, then their relationship with the Western Chalukyas, and later on the Rashtrakuta. So his writings have been, say, for example, that whole issue from Ajanta to Ellora has been a great guide for me to understand the art of Maharashtra in general, and especially the art right from something like the Vakatakas, then the Kalachuris, then the Chalukyas, and then the Rashtrakutas. So his work has been a great source of inspiration for me, and it made me all the time think about the art historical development in Maharashtra from a more, you can say, more objective point of view. And therefore, I slightly amended his chronology because of one of the considerations, and that is the inscriptional evidence. Dr. Mirashi was not at all very clear regarding the caves of the Ashmakas. So he avoided giving illustrations of the cave of the Ashmakas. He was concentrating only on 16 to 21 and 1 and 2. He was not ready to accept that the caves, Ashmaka caves, were in any way connected, and therefore he doesn't illustrate that also. But then it was because of Professor Spink, as he rightly said, that the caves which were not completed gave so many clues, and they helped to understand the complete, you can say, relative chronological setup at Ajanta itself. But then, because of the Ashmakas, now I am able to understand the relationship between the areas like which are to the south, on the south bank of Godavari, and now are very clearly understood as Ashmaka. We can understand the relationship of the Dharashiv caves and, you can say, the Ajanta caves. So that is one more benefit of his insight. And there is another thing, as I said, regarding understanding of the relationship between all these. It becomes more and more clear when we try to understand these caves from the content point of view. That work was to some extent done by his own student Cohen, who differed with him because of the same evidence. And he said that the whole story in the Dashakumara Charita was totally differently interpreted by him. But one contribution we have to take into consideration of Cohen, that is, he put together all the inscriptions and put them, gave a very critical, you can say, examination to those, and established the relationship between the literature part and the art historical part. I would say that even if Cohen differs with Professor Spink, it was because of him only that such a type of ground was created, and that ground is now followed by me, even before Cohen, and by persons like Dr. Suresh Pandit, that, well, we have to have a sort of a understanding of the content with the art historical material. I would have to mention about the work of Dr. Suresh Pandit, because it was again one of the students of Professor Spink that Marilyn Lees worked on the caves, and she tried to understand and set up a very good chronology, a relative chronology at Kanheri on the basis of the methodology which was perfected by Professor Spink, and that helped Suresh Pandit to understand the Traikutaka aspect which was there in the caves at Kanheri. So I would say that, well, meaning here is a man who worked for something like more than 60 years on one topic and had created grounds to critically examine and understand the cave architecture, not only of Ajanta, but in relation to that, even the Brahmanical architecture, as also period-wise the architecture of the Kalachuris, then the Chalukyas, and then later on the Chalukyas, and then later on the Rashtrakutas also. So more and more I think about Professor Spink, I realize that, well, I cannot simply imagine that if this man would not have worked on Ajanta, the way today we understand our own cave architecture would not have gone much beyond what Ferguson and Burgess had said earlier, except some things to know about it. I will have to mention again in this connection our own endeavor, that is myself and Dr. Mane. We took up the work of studying the caves in Vidarbha and Madhya Pradesh of the Vakataka period. So you'll find that because of his work and because of his a very critical way of trying to understand the absolute as also the relative chronology, many generations to come, at least one or two generations, will be guided in the understanding of the cave architecture of Maharashtra very well. I'm again overwhelmed when I see the way he has worked out the whole thing and made people to critically think about, even if they differed with him, he made them think about, like Dr. Khandalwala never lost his, changed his opinions, but he had to, as I told you, that instead of 150 years, he had to accept that, well, it was at least done in 60 years. So this way he has given a different way of critically examining and his own methodology, which the book is containing. I could understand it very well when Dr. Jerry Malandra gave her very exhaustive and beautiful analysis of the development of his own methodology, as also his own critical examination of his own views from time to time. And therefore today I am really happy to see that, well, Dr. Jerry Malandra has given us this monograph, which will be very useful to go through all the 8 volumes. All the students, it may not be possible. So his small guide, which is for a visitor, you can say, but he has to be an intelligent visitor. Similarly, this monograph will help all of us. Meaning, when I say all of us, including myself, is going to help to understand and develop your own way of critically examining the caves. I therefore am thankful, I would say, even grateful to Jerry for doing this great work, and hope that this publication will help the future scholars in their studies to a large extent, and it will impress them, it will shape them, it will mold them. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to express some of my experiences and views about how I myself developed in cave architecture and how I could see from a close distance Professor Spink's work, because he all the time used to invite me for all his yearly seminars. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jamkedkar.
Thank you, sir.
I think Alan is going to show us some very, very interesting things that the India Study Center Trust has recently developed. So thanks to the heavy demand from everybody, the India Center Trust has decided to come out with some merchandise. And at the moment, it's very archaeology-oriented merchandise. We have a really, really beautiful calendar for 2022. We have two options. You can either have an A3 calendar with the bearded man figure from Mohenjo-daro, or you can have the same with the bronze female figurine from Mohenjo-daro. So these are the two main calendars that we have. And these are, of course, masterpieces of Bronze Age art. For those who want both, we also have the option of having a calendar in half and half. So 6 months with the bearded man and 6 months with the bronze girl. So which one you'd like, you can either have either or you can have both of the above. So we won't come between you and your choices. We've also come up with some really beautiful fridge magnets. Since today is all about what is Spink and Ajanta and Ellora, these are the three Ellora versions that we have. We have the beautiful Andhaka panel. We have, of course, the Kailasha cave, which we've all alluded to before in two different things, including Henry Cousins's very, very famous line drawing of Kailash, which actually puts it into enormous perspective. I had the enormous good fortune of actually going for the first time in my life to see Ellora with Walter Spink. Thank God I didn't go without him. So we've got these really, really beautiful fridge magnets. And for those of you all with a more work-oriented background, we've come up with a really lovely 2022 planner. All of these are available on pre-order on our website. And we're really, really looking forward to you all clicking on institucent.org and going to our merchandise page, Institucent merch. And well, every single paisa that you spend will go towards more critical work in the fields of archaeology, geology, astronomy, the sciences, literature, and the activities of the India Study Center Trust. So we're looking forward to all of you all really coming on board in a big way. Also, a lot of things planned for 2022, including, of course, the second batch of the archaeology diploma. The first batch comes to an end in December. So I'm looking forward to seeing many of you all with us next year. And before I go on and on about myself and the India Study Center Trust, it's over to Dr. Dejesus Gary, who's going to be our concluding speaker for the evening. So Dr. Gary, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Kurush. Good evening, Dr. Jamkedkar. Good evening, Jerry Malandra. It was really sad that I could not actually join last time, and I did not have this privilege to join dais with you two when the formal lectures took place on the same dais. So it's a great occasion today that we are here together, though online. And of course, I know Professor Jamkedkar for several years, and we keep on meeting and discussing over several issues. I did not have a good fortune to meet you in person, but I hope that will happen soon in future. Well, coming back to Walter or Uncle, as we call, as we all ASI people call him, my first memory of him goes back to 2003. I was introduced to him quite late as compared to all you people, and I had read few publications on of him, and I was quite interested as a young researcher. I was quite interested to listen to him personally in Ajanta. My superintendent said, "Why you want to listen to this man? He is a great critic of ASI. You will hear nothing but criticism. Still, you want to waste your time?" I said, "Yes, I don't mind wasting my time." So somehow I managed permission. I reached to Ajanta. And the first question that Walter asked me, oh, you are the new appointee here. What more damage are you going to bring to this site? I was literally awestruck. I was struck with his sarcasm. I had absolutely no answer. But then we geared up slowly, and those 3 days with Walter, Dr. Suraj Pandit, were actually amazing. I could see Ajanta with altogether new perspective. And so, congratulations to you, Jerry, and thanks to Institution Trust for bringing up this wonderful volume, which brings all memories of water alive back again. And though I was lavishly and generously introduced by our friend Dr. Kush Dalal, I'm moreover a documentarian. Mostly, I have done documentation work, and I think due to all the administrative responsibilities, I'm going to take up actual research after I retire from the department. But yes, it is on the agenda. So right now, documentation is on, and I hope to step into your steps at some point of time in future. So thank you all of you for having me, and it was wonderful to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garge. I know I wouldn't say this to anybody else, but we are so looking forward to your retirement as we are looking forward to the years you have with the department, because we see some amazing things coming up in the future with the department and after the department. So thank you very, very much for being with us for all of this. And thank you for your words. I think today's program comes to an end with this. So I'll ask Dr. Mugdha Karnik to come and deliver the vote of thanks to everybody over here and to give her views on what has happened and anything that she might like to say. Thank you very, very much.
Well, my first thanks goes to Jerry, of course, because she has done this whole work. She was, in fact, asking me for the 12 volumes, but here nobody can really afford to have them. Let's see, in some future, we will have those volumes by Walter Spink in our library. Let's see. And the second, of course, very important, the thanks goes to Dr. Jamkedkar, because it was he who suggested that after Jerry's lecture last time, he suggested that this should be published. This is very important, the way she so methodically she went about Walter and Walter's work. It was he who suggested that we should come out with this monograph. And Jerry, in her busy schedule, she still took time. I mean, she devoted time for this, and she has really done a wonderful job. We are all indebted to you, Jerry, absolutely indebted. And of course, thanks goes to my team, especially Alan and Shashank Sawant, he is celebrating his wedding anniversary, so he's not here, but he has done the work, and it is so beautiful. To see Walter again like this, last time in our Rock Cut Caves proceedings, and now this. I really feel very good about it, because me and Walter, we were to meet. He said, Mugdha, I'm going to take you to dinner or lunch, whatever suits you. And poor Walter, poor me, he could not come. He did not make it. It was about the interview taken by Vinayak, which he took in Marathi, published in Marathi, and I translated. He was so happy. Well, let me not talk about Walter, because we all do miss him so much. It's very difficult to talk about him. I just like Dr. Garge, I knew him for a very short while, but so much love I gained. So much, he gave everything to students anyway. When we took our trip to Ajanta and he was talking about Ajanta, it was a different experience. So anyway, so to to retain Walter's memory is absolutely, it will be natural with all of us. But to retain what he is talking about Ajanta, is very difficult to grasp because it is so much work, and people like me who are not from the discipline of archaeology, it's very difficult for us to grasp the whole thing. Well, Jerry has given us, the whole crux of the thing in this monograph, and it's lovely to read Jerry's language and Jerry's style. My God, this is really something fantastic which Jerry has done, and Institution has been instrumental in bringing it out and giving it to you. I'm really so thankful to all of you who have attended. And well, Sonal here says, what great contribution by such passionate scholars. Thank you to, yes, Sonal. I'm sure most of you will be very thankful to Jerry Malandra and in turn to Dr. Jamkedkar, because he suggested that this should come out, as I told you. And my whole team is very happy to do this today. The second part of the announcement which Kurush just did was about the merchandise, memorabilia, archaeology. See, when we go to Aurangabad, we hardly find anything that we can take with us. You generally come across all those hats and t-shirts, which are available everywhere and anywhere. But some very specific things that will talk about archaeology, that will talk about wonders in archaeology, we are going ahead with it. I want all of you will cooperate with me. I am sure of that. And let's take this ahead. Dr. Garge is also with us. We definitely would want to help the OAM to do these things. And we, of course, want their help to help us grow. Okay, so I think that's all. Jerry, there are people asking me after your last lecture that your work about other topics should also be brought forth, and you should give more lectures to us. I'm sure I can demand that from you, and you will oblige me. I will always be under obligation. Thank you very much. Any questions to Jerry?
Jerry, you're muted. You need to unmute.
It wasn't, the website was not allowing me to unmute, but now I am.
Yeah, if there are any questions to Jerry Malandra or Dr. Jamkedkar or Dr. Garge or Dr. Dalal, you may please.
So there are a lot of comments, ma'am.
Yeah.
Shubha Khandekar says, congratulations, Jerry, lovely monograph, not only insightful and comprehensive, it comes from the heart. What a joy to hear you read it. Can't thank you enough. Shinil Payamal says, can we expect a non-Kindle version of the book? We are working on it and we hope to have one soon, Shinil. I see Alan has said exactly that. Kanchan Jadhav says, very enlightened lectures. Thank you. Institution. Shubha Khandekar says, thank you, Dr. Jamkedkar. You've already read Sonal's comment. Ankur says, so happy to hear about the merchandise. I'm just drooling over it. Can't wait to order them. Thanks to everyone for this lecture at Institution. Waterspink.com shut down sometime in July.
Oh.
It seems, by the way. And that's quite sad to hear. I didn't know that. I suppose.
Maybe we can contact somebody and do something about it. That's it.
Well,
yeah.
That's all we have over here for today. So thank you very, very much. We look forward to your support always. And the India Study Center Trust will keep doing things. I must thank a lot of people behind the scenes. I mean, there's Alan, of course, and Shashank, who were directly instrumental in this monograph. But there's also Riddhi and Yogini and Anirudh and Rushi and so many more people. I mean, I could go on and on and on listing them. But they've all been there behind the scenes, making sure that these things happen. So without them, we couldn't be where we are. So thank you very much, Team Institution. And of course, Mrs. Karnik for being there behind us and backing us solidly. Mr. Karnik for standing behind Mrs. Karnik. And of course, all of you all out there who have supported us so ably throughout this lockdown. I want to tell you all folks something before we leave. We've done over 150 different certificate courses, 2 diploma courses, and so many other lectures in English and Hindi, along with, in many cases, the Department of Archaeology and Museums, which has very ably supported us. We've also had some fascinating lectures by overseas scholars like William Malandra and Jerry Malandra. And of course, we've got people like Dr. Jamkedkar and Dr. Garge standing very solidly behind us in our endeavors. So thank you very much, everybody. Shubha, Vinayak, Elizabeth, Nitin, Manjari ma'am. So many of you all were here, Sonal, Ajit Prasad. And if I kept mentioning all of you all, I think I'd run out of time. Yul, Adil, and all of you all. Thank you so very much for being here, so very much for doing all the things that you've done with us. And we look forward to your continued support. Thank you very much. Take it away, Riddhi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry.
Good night.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thank you.